Hello, and welcome to the International Science Festival's digital program. My name is Fredrik Ekenvi, and today I have the immense pleasure of introducing our first speaker of the week. Staffan I. Lindberg is the founder and director of the V-Dem Institute at the University of Gothenburg, and today's lecture is called How is Democracy Doing? An International Perspective. There is a chat where you can ask questions if you have any. And for those of you that are currently in Hyperworld, please use the Vimeo chat as we are not able to see any questions that are asked through the chat in Hyperworld. The stage is yours, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Fredrik. And a pleasure to be here at the Science Festival, talk about democracy. Today's talk will be based on the latest democracy report from the V-Dem Institute, Democracy Winning and Losing at the Ballot. The analysis I will talk about here today is based on the V-Dem dataset. V-Dem stands for Varieties of Democracy, which is a large-scale global international collaboration in the social sciences involving over 4,200 scholars and other experts from over 180 countries. With their help, we have over the years collected data on democracy, human rights, civil society, media, judicial systems, and so on. Some 600 variables giving information on very different aspects of democracy and governance, if you like, across the world. The V-Dem dataset these days has about 31 million data on democracy. It's available from the website along with online graphing tools and this democracy report that comes out in March every year. Democracy winning and losing at the ballot. This is a title that this year we hope sort of reflects what we start seeing in the world. Democracy now, finally, I should say, after decades of autocratization spreading across the world, there's some hope with democracy winning at the ballot in places like Brazil, turning a process of autocratization around with a critical election and bringing democratic actors back into power and turning things around, or recently in Poland and some other cases, but also democracy losing at the ballot because autocratization, or if you like, decline in democratic qualities, often start with anti-pluralist, reactionary, nationalist parties and leaders being elected into power in pretty free and fair elections, and then starting to undermine democracy. This is what the science says. It's not a political statement. And ballots, elections, supposedly multi-party elections, supposedly free and fair, or so acclaimed by rulers, is also used to solidify autocratic rule, as we saw this year in March in Russia, to take one example. So there are these contrasting trends. The world is in a global wave of autocratization, but there are some positive signs that I will also come back to that have to do with elections, but also other aspects of processes of democratization and autocratization. So this year's report has 5 parts, and I'm going to give you some short highlights from each of the 5 parts. First, what is the state of democracy in the world? Where are we at? Well, you can take different perspectives on this. Here is a graph showing the Liberal Democracy Index from V-Dem and its development over the last 50 years. And you can see that third wave of democratization that started with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974, and then the spread of democratic rights and freedoms in many countries across the world, from Southern Europe over to Latin America in the 80s, and then with the fall of Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, large portions of former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, but also countries in Africa and in Asia moved along upwards on indices of democracy and became more free and fair. Not all of them became democracies, but more democratic. And then we've had this sliding back that's been discussed in the literature for the last decade or 2 decades or more, depending on how you analyze the data. So this graph is based on country averages. So each country in the world weigh the same. And you can say, okay, that's a fair view of how much democracy there is in the world, or not. So in this type of metric used here, then a small country like the Seychelles, this island nation out in the Indian Ocean, with 90,000 inhabitants, weigh as much as, say, India with 1.4 billion people. If democracy goes up in Seychelles like it's been doing for the last decade or so, that sort of compensates for democracy going down in India, which it has been also for a decade or more. So another way is to say, okay, well, democracy is ruled by the people, so it matters how many people have a certain level of democracy. So weigh these averages not by country, but by population size. And then it looks like this. Then that you still see that upward trend during the third wave of democratization, and then that third wave of autocratization in the last 10, 15 years. It's much more dramatic, indicating that a lot of people are affected. So big countries with large populations are sliding back on democracy much more than small countries with small populations. You can also weigh by territory, so the size of the country. And then again, the downward trend is much more marked than the country averages, but less so than the population weighted. And then this, weighed by GDP, share of world GDP. So you can think of this with that dramatic decline, indicating how much democracy is losing out in the world in terms of economic power versus countries that are autocracies. We pay a lot of attention to the population weighted because it has that democracy perspective of ruled by the people. I'll come back to that in some analysis here. And by that perspective, we've seen at least 15 years where the world has been dominated by autocratization in the world. We can also take the same underlying data. There are 48 indicators that go into the Liberal Democracy Index and slice it, or use it rather, to categorize countries in a more sort of crude, let's say unsophisticated, a little more sort of big picture view of different regimes types. So from closed autocracies that don't hold multi-party elections for the executive at least, so think Saudi Arabia and North Korea and those sorts of countries, to electoral autocracies. So think of them as they hold multi-party elections, on paper at least, and in some countries they are relatively multi-party, but either the quality of the elections or the surrounding environment in terms of media freedom, associational freedom for civil society and unions and political parties are not good enough for the country to qualify as a democracy. So on one end of the scale, within that, it's a pretty big box. So you have on one end Putin's Russia today, that is very, very authoritarian, and the elections are just a sham, orchestrated something. To at the sort of upper end of that big box, you have countries like India or Hungary today, that are much more free and and open, but not good enough anymore to be classified as democracies. And then electoral democracies where, the elections and those basic freedoms of media and civil society and so on are good enough, so they're at least democracies. And then at the upper end, you have the sort of really good democracies, liberal democracies, where have also rule of law and extensive protection of rights and checks and balances and better accountability mechanisms. If we take that perspective, the last 50 years, it looks like this. So the third wave of democratization, starting there in the 70s, meant a lot fewer of close dictatorships. A lot of military dictatorships, one-party states disappeared. And we got a lot more democracies, both liberal and electoral democracies, but also a lot more electoral autocracies. A lot of countries that moved from close dictatorship became electoral autocracies, but not good enough for becoming democracies. And in the last sort of 10, 15 years here, we've seen an uptick in close dictatorships again, and a downward trend on electoral autocracy. So what is happening as part of this wave of autocratization we are in, that countries that are already autocracies are becoming worse, right? And at the other end of the scale, you have there fewer liberal democracies and more electoral democracies. So again, then the really good democracies becoming less good democracies. You can look at this from the population perspective, the same categories there over these 50 years. And then by that metric, it's at least 20 years that we've seen this increase in the share of the world population living in non-democratic countries. So in that perspective, we're talking about more like a wave starting 20 years ago. And we are now in a situation where 71% of the world population live in one or the other type of autocracy. A radical, quite dramatic upward shift in the last 20 years. Is this unevenly distributed across the world? This gives you some idea on that. From East Asia and Pacific, where a lot of the population, of course, in China, large portion there live in close dictatorships. South and Central Asia, where most people live in electoral autocracies. Middle East and North Africa being divided between the two. Sub-Saharan Africa, well, about half of the population, a little bit more but about half in electoral autocracies, and then a little bit more with the close dictatorships. And then Eastern Europe, no close dictatorships, but a significant share there in electoral autocracies. And then we have Western Europe and Latin America and Caribbean, where there are more democracies. So maybe no big surprise, but sort of there are these very stark regional differences. And what we know now and have known for quite some time is that when countries autocratize, one area that's affected the most and often first is freedom of expression, often media freedom. But what we see that's new in this year's report is that also elections, the core institution of democracy, is being undermined and under attack. So here's a graph illustrating this. This is from 10 years ago. So 2013, different components of democracy. So you have their freedom of expression, freedom of association, those things. And then by 10 years ago, just counting how many countries were getting better in this area of democracy and how many were getting worse. Statistically significant. All the changes we talk about are statistically significant. So you see for clean elections there was getting better in 23 countries 10 years ago and getting worse in only 10, right? So if you're above that diagonal line, then things are getting better in more countries than they're getting worse. It looked like democracy was still moving ahead, and clean elections in particular. Compare this now to the end of 2023. Boom. All the aspects almost are below that diagonal line. And worst of all out there, freedom of expression getting worse in 35 countries, but also now clean elections has moved down and out there to the right, and getting worse in 23 countries, the opposite, right? Um, and getting better in only 12. So it's a complete 180-degree shift. This gives you an idea of what the last 10 years have meant for democracy in the world. And we see this also on the indicator level. Um, Now, here's the top 10 list of going down from these components of democracy to specific indicators. And worst of all, up there, government censorship of the effort of the media, governments trying to censor the media, freedom of academic and cultural expression, harassment of journalists, and then elections, free and fairness. So here are the sort of very specific individual aspects of democracy that are in the last 10 years have been affected in the most countries, up to then 45 countries getting worse on this with censorship effort of the media. That's one of the things that autocratizing countries often attack first and the most. So what are the trends? We see right now in the data that there are 60 countries in ongoing episodes of regime transformation or change. It's across the world in all kinds, in all regions, and 42 of those, of the 60, are countries autocratizing, and only 18 democratizing. Here in this graph, you can see this over the last 50 years again. There was that with a blue line, a dotted line that indicates the number of countries each year that we count as being in a episode of democratization. And there in the mid 1990s, there were 70 countries at the same time moving ahead on democracy, and the world was looking bright and future was looking good. And Frank Fukuyama wrote a book that was called The End of History, and then it's just fallen, slumped down there. And at the same time, the number of autocratizing countries going up quite radically. And again, here about at least 20 years of this development, maybe even longer, maybe even 30 years since that uptick in the number of autocratizing countries started. It is here in the graph, it's a map showing which countries are right now in episodes. We have there Brazil, democratizing countries, and a few others, but some of them are so small they are hard to see. And then all these countries that are in autocratization, including big countries like India, our neighbors, Hungary and Poland, but things may be just turning around there, Mexico, all across the world. This graph shows essentially the same information. Is the countries above the line, the democratizing countries, below the line, the autocratizing countries. These bubbles are then showing the size of the populations of those countries. Gives you an idea also about this, how big share of the world that live in these countries that are autocratizing. It's not only India, of course, although that's a big contributed to this, but there are a number of other countries that are also pretty big and are autocratizing. And now, total of 35% of the world population live in autocratizing countries. Again, quite dramatic shift in the last 20 years. There are 42 countries, that's up from 11 in the last 20 years. So no matter how we look at this data, the change is quite dramatic. And I think this is an important other perspective on this. So you can be autocratizer, as I talked about before, you can be already an autocracy and then getting worse, right? So you can autocratize further if you like. But out of the 42 that are right now in episodes of autocratization, 28 were democracies when the process started. Excuse me. And with our data, we can track it back exactly to when it started and so on. Only about half of them now remain democracies. that's a fatality rate of about 50%. So just the statistical probability that if you as a country start to autocratize, um, the probability that it will survive as a democracy is pretty low. But we've also started to see more complexities in how autocratization unfolds. And with a new methodology that we use this year, we're also able to sort of distinguish these more clearly. And there are at least two types. So one is standalone autocratization, which we used to think of maybe all cases like that were like that. So think of India and stayed a democracy for a long time. Um, Nothing changes, and then sort of out of the blue, if you like, comes a period of autocratization in India with BJP taking power and with Narendra Modi. And then this other type, which you can think of as failed democratization. So you have a period of democratization that is broken and quickly turned around into autocratization. And the autocratization is sort of, in one way or the other, a reaction to or connected to that initial period of democratization. So we developed a methodology to identify these systematically. And here is how it looks. So here are the top 10 lists you don't want to be on in terms of still ongoing episodes of autocratization that are these standalone type. And you can see that they start at very different levels, so it can happen at different levels of democracy. They also differ very much in terms of length. Some are being ongoing for a long time, like Hungary and India and Serbia as well. And others started much more recently and have moved sort of in a more speedily fashion downwards, say Mauritius there. But note at the end of this, of these top 10 now ongoing, 8 out of the 10 are no longer democracies. That's a pretty high fertility rate. Now we have these bell turns, and here is the top 10 list of the bell turns. Again, they start and end at very different levels, so it's not like it's only happening to really bad autocracies that try to democratize a little bit. It can happen. We also have South Korea there that has had this bell turn development, although staying a liberal democracy throughout this episode. They are still ongoing, so we don't know where they're going to end specifically, but they also have different lengths, and some are more dramatic, like Armenia, and others are more sort of developing over a longer term. Again, about the same proportion, only 3 out of the 10 remain democracies. And also among these countries, if we look at all the autocratizers, we see this trend now towards elections increasingly being part of what wannabe dictators undermine. That shows up also in, if we look at specific indicators, here is the top 20 declining indicators, but looking only at the countries autocratizing. And in that top 20 list, we have 3 indicators of that tap into the quality of elections that are on that list. And we didn't used to see this, right? They didn't used to show up. And at very top there, it's the autonomy of the electoral management body. That's a very consistent finding now, that among the countries autocratizing, what rulers attack when it comes to elections primarily is to undermine the autonomy, independence of the electoral management body. We also see freedom of expression of the media, of course, among these countries, a host of indicators there that are being attacked and undermined, right? If you want to be a dictator, you don't want the media to be free and independent and report about what you're actually doing. No, you want them to tell good stories about you. That's very obvious in this data. So that shows up no matter how we sort of slice this. But there are some good news. There are some democratizing countries, although the numbers have been going down. in the last 20 years, about half now. But there are these 18, um, and they tend to be fairly small, right? So it's only 5% of the world population that live in these 18 countries, compared to the 35 that live in the autocratizing countries. And half of that 5% is Brazil. But it's good. And also here we find this distinction between the standalone, independent sort of democratization episodes, the way we used to think about them, but we also find these U-turns. So think of them as the failed autocratization, or autocratization that was halted, stopped, and turned around. And the standalone cases, there are 9 among these 18, so half of them are standalone episodes. Again, they also start at very different levels of democracy. They're still ongoing, so we don't know exactly where they will end, but they're right now somewhat concentrated there in the mid portion of the democracy index, with Seychelles being this big star among the current democratizers, where things have been going really well. And then we have the U-turns, right? So here you have this big spread on terms of where they started and where they are currently at least. We have Brazil there, but also like a paradigmatic case like Zambia that also exemplifies what happens to most of these U-turns. They actually become electoral autocracies or even close dictatorships at the bottom of the U. And then they turn around. And I think there's some hope in that sort of in this world where so many countries are now autocratizing and have been autocratizing, that it is possible to stop, to halt this process in very different contexts and even turn it around and turn it into a new period of democratization and bring it back to previous levels of democracy. Zambia is a classic now almost example of that, where they were able to use, with mobilization of civil society and unification of all the opposition parties and support from the international community, and gather around and make one election really critical to turn it around and make democracy win at the ballot. We've also now studied this in all episodes across the world since 1900 with the long time series data that V-Dem has. And here it was really surprising to us to see that across these all cases of autocratization that we have in the data since 1900, is that about half that were turned around in a U-turn. And that this has even increased to 70% of the cases in the last 30 years. And that, again, is some possible hope. Of course, there's no natural law saying that this will continue. We may be now in a phase where countries do not turn around, where autocrats become stronger and prevent this from happening. But at least this points to a possibility, and we shouldn't give up, if you look at it that way, or the forces in favor of democracy around the world should not give up. There is a possibility to turn things around. Now, the last couple of minutes here, I want to touch on the last section of the report that we call Windows into the Future. Beyond these cases, the 42 cases that we know are in an episode of autocratization, there are also, unfortunately, 25 that have started to slide down on democracy and have come pretty close to reaching the threshold for these statistical significance and substantial changes to make them what should I say, verified, certified case of autocratization. They've moved halfway or more towards that sort of threshold, but they are not yet classified as autocratization. So the 42 cases that are now, we know, autocratization right now could in the coming years rapidly increase if just a handful of these 25 near misses come to qualify as autocratizers. So that's worrying. Here are the top 5 near misses, top 5 in terms of magnitude of change. So you can see there are some seemingly pretty substantial changes in these countries, also at very different levels of democracy initially. And these are among the ones that could in the next year or two qualify as autocratizers. Significantly, of course, Georgia and South Africa there, but also the other cases. Luckily, there are some near misses of democratization, not as many. Only 9 that are coming somewhat close to be cases of democratization. Here are the top 5 in terms of the magnitude of change, and where we think also this could be a message to people out there in the international democracy promotion community, thinking about, okay, so these are some of the cases that perhaps deserve some more attention and support these positive processes so that they can actually come and become more of real democratizers, if you like. And finally, with a perspective into the future, a lot of people are talking about 2024 as the year of elections. We're now in April. A number of countries have gone through elections, but many more are to follow. Some observers, many have talked about that it's a record number of countries in the world holding elections this year. A lot of them are big countries with large populations, so it's also a record share of the world population that go to the polls this year. But it's also this. We have 60 countries in the V-Dem data set that are among these that are holding elections this year. 31 of them, elections take place in an autocratizing or declining context. Only 3 countries that are on a positive track. The data looks like this. So you have here to the left standalone and belt turn autocratizers, and then that's 20 together, and then 11 more that are among these near misses, where the elections can really mean the difference between becoming an autocratizer and really go down that negative path, or stop and halt autocratization in its tracks, preferably turn things around. There are only 3 cases there. They are U-turns. So this, to me at least, really adds emphasis to what some people have called 2024 as not only the year of elections, but a make or break year for democracy in the world. And I think these data here really puts that into perspective. And one could add that in that category of other, where we don't see any, as of now, in the last 5 years, any statistically meaningful change in either direction. There's still some really contested, and I would say for the world, really significant cases. United States is in that category. And the United States is, and that's not only my assessment, but something that a lot of distinguished academics and other observers in the United States and beyond has been saying that democracy in the US is in a really difficult place. For one, I'm on record before in international media and other international fora discussing this, saying that I do not think that democracy in the United States would survive another period with Trump. And again, that's not a political statement. It's based on his track record as former president and his statements and declarations, what he would do should he come into power. The rhetoric he's been using and increasingly larger shares of the GOP, the Republican representatives, that is the same that many would become autocratizers have used before them. So it's based on data. It's based also on other people's assessment about the risks involved with this in the future, and the ramifications for Europe and for the world would be enormous, of course. So the other cases there is not necessarily an unproblematic category. On that not so bright note, as the highlights from this year's democracy report, democracy winning and losing at the ballot. Everything is available from our website. The data, free to download, all the documentation, everything is transparent. The democracy report, other reports. We also have these online graphing tools. If you don't like to download 31 million data points and run in your statistical software, if that's not your cup of tea, then you can still access all the data, do your own analysis. In one of these now 13 online tools that we have, download those graphs that you generate, use them freely in papers or in journalism or in reports. Thanks for listening. It's been a pleasure being here at the Science Festival and talking to you about the somewhat depressing trends about democracy in the world. Thank you. I cannot hear you, Fredrik. Maybe that's just me, or...
No, so thank you so much for giving us this lecture. It was super interesting. There doesn't seem to be any questions from the audience, so I would like to ask you if there are any closing thoughts or like last remarks that you'd like to leave us with.
You know, I frequently am asked to talk about this and then interact with different aspects of the international community, whether it's donor agencies or foreign ministries of foreign affairs or international NGOs working with democracy support and election support. And I can tell you that it's when I speak about our data and the analysis we show, none of them out there that is working in the real world have programs in countries across the world. None of them almost ever raise any, say, concern that we are exaggerating. If anything, the opposite, unfortunately. And maybe on a more hopeful note, I also get the sense that many of them are really, really, really taking this seriously and putting all the effort and the money they can into work in support of democracy and protection of democracy around the world. And that includes thousands and thousands of independent civil society organizations, of course, from unions to church organizations or what have you. And that to me is a source of hope. So that's
Well, yeah, hopefully we all believe in a better world. But thank you all for watching. And thank you, Staffan, for being here once again. It was super interesting. Be sure to check out our other lectures that starts at 6 p.m. every day, except on Sunday, where it starts at 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. by using the same link that got you here. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.